So good morning to those who are able to join us and those who will be watching this in their own leisure. I'm Richard Seeline. I'm the co-founder of the Resilience Innovation Hub and part of the Resilience Innovation Investor Forum team. We're very excited about our global panel this morning and appreciate those who are joining us later in their day. Thank you, Monica and Tony, especially for giving up a little bit of your late afternoon. I wanted to make sure we set the tone for this session by giving some of you who may be joining us for the first time a little bit of background on the forum. David, as you know and have recalled, we went from a 2-day in-person 250 attendee to having to break it up into these different series and panels remotely. And we look forward to returning in person later in April, May, and June in different parts around the United States in our 1-day settings. But this to give you a little bit of idea, and you all can, again, read faster than I can talk, but in our focus on future-proofing, what we've really looked at using the forum is a means of optimizing more efficiently, bringing all of the different pieces together: investors, insurance, non-insurance, communities, technology, all the different folks that have an interest in this idea of pre-disaster and risk mitigated resilience, which obviously includes challenges and issues around sustainability and climate. We are very, very action focused. This is not theory. This is not another study. We want to take what we're doing today in these forum series and begin to move it into practice and into the field. And if there ever was a panel that knows practice and implementation, it would be this one today. Now, Monica and Tony, this has a little bit of an American focus to it, but it doesn't mean that you all are not, without the various disasters in not just Europe, but around the world and different places that you all, Stewart, deal with. But what we've now recognized in the States is that we are going back to back to back billion-dollar types of disasters and perils. And by the way, these are sometimes not back-to-back, Tony. They are literally one on top of each other. So if you take the overlay of COVID on top of floods and storms and tornadoes and ice and, what's happening now, I think we are finding around the world is that every community, every business is in a state of preparing for, in the middle of, or responding to. And as a result of that, it really has driven now in the States, and again, you all know, whether it's the UN, OECD, Stewart, your work with the Resilient Cities Network, what we now realize is that there's a significant focus from a public policy at the national, state, and local level, but more importantly, a significant amount of discussion around how to allocate resources differently at a global level. And that, again, is what our session is about, is to learn from our global partners and what are opportunities to apply those lessons in the United States and vice versa. This needs to be a two-way discussion. Now, surely, Tony, of all people, you have seen that there is abundant amount of resources. For the first time, especially in the United States right now, we have abundant amount of resources, but sometimes it's like trying to find the proverbial needle in the haystack. It's very difficult to figure out who's got what resources, how they are applied, which ones are focused on which types of outcomes. So part of this challenge of abundant resources is to also raise how do we make it a lot easier and smoother to access the resources, whether they're public, private, or philanthropic. Just 2 days ago, the Pew Charitable Trust held a webinar in the United States on this very topic of challenges within our own national government to get money out the door that's readily available. So part of the challenge, David, right, is for us to hear about what are some ways to move resources, and it may be non-traditional ways to move those resources. Because in the United States right now, we have over $1 trillion of reinsurance resources that are available for reinvestment through what we call catastrophic or resilience bonds. We still have, on top of the $1 trillion that we just passed in infrastructure dollars, we have a whole set of other funds that are available through traditional program areas of our national federal agencies. And then again, as you all are very aware, there's over $12 trillion of generational wealth globally that's changing hands and going into social impact and different types of programs. Stewart, specifically some of the programs that you've been helping guide and put together. So I want to turn over this to our good friend and partner, David Dodd, with the International Sustainable Resilience Center. Let David really guide you, yourself, David, Monica, Tony, and Stewart. I'll ask that you have them do better and more proper introductions, make some opening comments, and then David, let's really have a dialogue and have a conversation. And then as we look to some of our attendees, see what questions they have. But I want to put my one bias, and that is before, David, we end our webinar, our session today, that we will come up with a series of a call to action of what we all can do individually and collectively from the results of our discussion. So David, let me turn it over to you, and thank you so much for organizing this panel.
It's my pleasure, Richard, and anyone that knows you knows how much blood, sweat, and tears you put into this, and it's paying off, because I've seen a couple of the sessions and they're incredible. You've set a very high bar for us, but I think we can reach it with the panel we have. And I'm glad that you know, and I was talking with the team yesterday about the audience and who would be watching this. In particular, Tony, because of his position with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, said, okay, you know, we want to talk about developing countries. And I told them exactly what you told me when you asked me to put this together. I want this to be international. Yep. You always said I'm your international guy, so I have to live up to that, and I think we've done that today. So,
David, let me emphasize two things, and I'll put myself back on mute, I promise. One is that as of the past two sessions, we've hit over 400 individuals that are downloading or watching this at their leisure, which tells me something, all right? That people do want to watch this, the content's important, the message is important, but also, Tony, to something that you raised, which I will challenge this group, David, and that is we have a lot of lessons to learn globally. We're not the only ones, you know, sitting here in the United States that have all of the solutions. So Tony, please challenge us as well. David, I'm going to stop and let you talk.
Well, and I'll pick up on that just for a second, Richard. You know, this is on YouTube. The audience is global. And so, you know, our concern is that not only do we tell lessons from other nations, but that other nations are given information that can be very helpful to them, especially low-income developing nations. And all four of us focus on that, as you know. So I think this is a great atmosphere for the dialogue. I'm hoping this will be watched around the world. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel. Monica Altamirano is the partner and public-private partnership practice head at Now Partners, which is based in the Netherlands. PPP and infrastructure systems specialist and systems thinker with 18 years of experience in public-private partnerships. Monica is a multidisciplinary leader who has advised governments on how to catalyze private sector investments in infrastructure, water, and climate adaptation in Asia, Latin America, Europe, and Africa. She initiated and successfully implemented pioneering programs in resilient infrastructure, climate adaptation, and water security for the European Commission, the Netherlands government, the Green Climate Fund, the Organization of American States, Microsoft, and multilateral development banks. Monica previously worked as a PPP specialist for the Netherlands Water Institute Deltares as an advisor to the Netherlands government International Water Affairs team. And what I'm going to do, Richard, is introduce each panelist, ask them to make a few opening remarks, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So Monica, if you could just make a few opening remarks for us, that would be great.
Thank you, David. And yeah, great to be here. I'd like to add though something that I'm originally from Nicaragua, and I came to study in the Netherlands, back in 2002. And as you know, David, that's still part of the drive to look at these things, because that's one of the very much affected countries worldwide. Unfortunately, that set in motion other dynamics of sociopolitics that are not too good too. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think the way I like to start is that just acknowledging where we are, right? And that's where we see that climate change is already challenging our status quo as the frequency of extreme events keeps increasing. And as multiple studies of the World Bank and other institutions show, is costing already 6% of their GDP to certain countries and can cost more. But also, for example, the other studies from the Global Commission on Adaptation already see how these may force hundreds of millions of people from their homes by 2050, right? And and at the same time, we have like a 15 trillion infrastructure finance gap. So seems like an impossible puzzle altogether. And COVID, on the bright side, I would say, the COVID-19 is something that we all suffer from. It was a very clear reminder, that systemic risks are important, and that the way we have developed until now doesn't seem to be the way to get forward. So how do we we need a shift, in our economic development paradigm? And the question indeed, how do we deal with these interlocking challenges in a context of diminishing public resources, right? Because all economies have been hurt by this situation. And how do we make sure, and that's what I'm focusing on now also, and what I went from water to kind of like a wider sectoral perspective, is how can we make sure that our investments to stimulate these economies now, for example, don't lock us into the present, but enable us to leapfrog, right, to a more resilient and I would hope regenerative economy in both biophysical, but really also social and economic terms. And there is where I also think is before we start solving things, we need to kind of understand also how we came to be here, how to reverse these frightening trends, in yearly losses, and understand the dynamics between our economic growth models and environment, right? And I love, and I kind of every time state something that actually the Global Commission on Adaptation asked for, and that's 3 revolutions in understanding, in planning, and financing. And in understanding is the first step also that we normally do for master planning, right? Where are our vulnerabilities and so forth. But I would say we have to go a little bit further, that is to identify also how every time we choose to grow our cities, to grow our food and so forth, has this also in a way intrinsically caused an increase in our vulnerability, right? And are there other ways, therefore, that we can do that? So that's basically, I think, how can we have that paradigm shift in how we expand our cities, our infrastructure networks, and actually grow our economies? And I would say, and that's that the statement I would like to leave you with, is that the best place to start is to challenge the way we invest and rethink infrastructure investment planning processes in the public and private sector alike, because that's where we can get those at the right scale and think on those systemic risk part. That's what I like to start with, and looking forward to the conversation further.
Thank you so much, Monica. That really, you really did a good job of summing up the challenges and the way we need to approach doing infrastructure investment. And we all are involved in public-private partnerships. And Richard, you and I have had this discussion many times. That's, you know, what I specialize in, Tony, Monica, and Stewart also. And we feel that that's the only answer, because the neither sector alone can do it. And leveraging each other and forming these types of agreements to make infrastructure more resilient, to make cities more resilient, is really absolutely paramount. So now I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Tony Bonnici. Tony is the officer in charge and head of the Public-Private Partnership Program at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. He's based in Geneva, and he is responsible for promoting public-private partnerships for infrastructure development, where he leads a program at UNECE in Geneva on building the capacity of government to undertake successful projects in support of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to that, he was with the Diplomatic Service of Malta for 18 years, and he served as a senior diplomat in various countries, including Italy, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Tony has a law degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science in London, a master's degree in diplomatic studies and international relations, and a PhD in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And I neglected to mention that Monica also has a PhD. So we're with some really smart people. Tony, I just love your take on this, looking at the changing dynamics of both public and private investment, you know, due to the new awareness of the importance of climate and the environment and social issues as well. The SG movement is, you know, taking off like a rocket. So I'd love for you to comment on that, and then what do you see as the future for financing in public-private partnerships for both sectors?
Thank you, David, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you, Richard, for inviting us as well. I mean, coming from the United Nations, I have to start with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs in short. I'm sure you are all familiar with the SDGs. You know, this ambitious agenda, which everyone, not just the countries, but everyone is called for, you know, to contribute to its achievement by 2030. So we are it's a 15-year agenda. We are halfway, more or less, and we are sadly lacking behind. And of course, you know, COVID didn't help at all to make strides. Actually, it is setting us backwards in for example, with regards to goal number 3, which is universal healthcare. That is, you know, it's setting us a bit backwards. But this is not what I wanted to mention at this session at all. So my angle for the SDGs is infrastructure. Infrastructure is all over the SDGs. You know, infrastructure in variety of services. You know, health, education, transport, cities. But of course, there is a cost. And as it was mentioned earlier, the governments and governments alone are not able to master all this massive trillions of investments per year in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is the need for the private sector to put its knowledge, but also finance as well. But of course, the challenge the challenge is to get the finance where it needs to go. So finance is easy to go in OECD countries, in the United States, in France, Germany, other parts of Europe, developed world. The challenge and the battle for the SDGs is going to be lost or won on the ability, the capability of getting finance where it needs to go, which is the low and middle income countries. I keep saying it's not South London but it's South Sudan. That is where finance needs to go. And of course, these countries have their own risks. So there are massive investment risks. So how are we going together to work to overcome those risks? So that's one aspect. It's where investment needs to go, and perhaps investment is going not where it needs to go. So it needs to be channeled a bit differently. The challenge that the SDGs pose to PPPs is another one. The traditional PPPs, have been experimented, done for many, many years in developed OECD countries. And they were essentially as a tool, as a value for money tool to keep, to manage their assets in a way, and to bring value for money for the. So it was looked upon mainly as an economic tool or financing tool, with, I would say, little thought about the other pillars of the SDGs, which is the environmental and the societal. So what happened was that PPPs is mentioned as a preferred treatment, I would say, in the SDGs and in the 2030 agenda on sustainable development to achieve the massive investment needs. But the question that was raised since 2015 is, are PPPs fit for purpose for the SDGs? And this is something that we at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, we have been working on for several years now. And immediately it became evident to us that it wasn't. It wasn't fit for purpose. So what we try to do is we try to see to what extent the traditional PPPs with their value for money, which is very, very important, fundamental. Without economic effectiveness, financial viability of projects cannot happen. But how can we make sure that the environmental and the societal aspects are also considered in PPPs? So after various consultations, which took a few years, we came up with what we call the PPP, People First PPP approach for the SDGs, which essentially is captured into 5 preferable or desirable outcomes. And here we're talking about that these outcomes derive directly from the SDGs. And here we're talking about increased access to essential services during the project life cycle, and especially, and here we're talking about the vulnerable groups and the underserved, while at the same time lessening social inequality. So that's number one. Number two is improve economic effectiveness. That's the value for money angle for you. But also be careful about the fiscal sustainability. So PPPs have to be fiscally sound as well, so that governments don't get indebted too much that they will risk going bankrupt and defaulting. The third one is environmental sustainability. So cutting or significantly reducing CO2 emissions. But also enhancing resilience, and this is what we're talking about. Is the resiliency, which, as Richard explained earlier in his introduction, is massive, and they tend to come at the same time. It's like when you are waiting for a bus, they all come at the same time. this is what happens. So resilience is taking more prominence as we go along. The fourth one is projects that are easily replicable, so that they are not just done once, but they are done within the same country, but also outside that country. So that there is this exchange of experience among countries, so that countries can learn from each other. And the fifth one is it's very simple, but governments especially seems to fail to do it. It's involving all stakeholders in the planning and in the implementation of infrastructure. A lot of infrastructure fails because of protests in the streets as a result of lack of consultation with the stakeholders. So these are a couple of challenges. Maybe I can elaborate a little bit more, but maybe I stop here so that we can hear from Stewart, and then maybe in the debate I can elaborate a little bit further. Thank you, David.
Sure, sounds great, Tony. Stewart Sarkozy-Banoczy is Senior Advisor for North America Strategic Partnerships and Development Director for the Global Resilient Cities Network in Washington. This is the world's leading urban resilience network, consisting of member cities and chief resilience officers from the 100 Resilient Cities program, working toward rebuilding safe and equitable cities for all. Stewart's also the founder and chief Precoverist at Precovery Labs. I love that title, Stewart. At Precovery Labs, a hub for community impact and creativity. The firm focuses on strategy implementation and storytelling in support of resilience and recovery for the most vulnerable people and places. Stewart's specialties include island resilience, resilient cities, and indigenous community development. It's all yours, Stewart.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. And Richard, thanks for having us and having this conversation at the global level. And super pleased to be with my co-panelists. Actually humbled. I got to get on that PhD apparently. So from the viewpoint of the Resilient Cities Network, we have a definition of resilience that takes in all manner of shocks and stresses. And at the same time, we don't want to just be in kind of a survival and adaptation mode. So one of the most important parts of the definition that we have from the Resilient Cities Network is that it's survive, adapt, and thrive. And part of the reason that we focus on the thrive part is that that's where we're forward looking, and we're talking about building resilience. We're building the pre-recovery and the pre-recovery mindset, as opposed to being in recovery all the time, because that is quite often what is happening in our cities and communities of all sizes. And with that definition, our role in the Resilient Cities Network is to empower our set of cities and others and those that they partner with, and then mobilize and then implement. And the mobilization part is where I will key in most today, because I think part of the public-private partnership discussion and how we move projects means that we have to not just define what we mean by resilience, as we just described it in this holistic and equitable way, but also that we've really seen that we've got to programmatically use tools that do the right kinds of resilience lens setting and create the resilience value, while we're also creating things like the Resilient Community Impact Fund, which we're doing now, and find ways to measure and indicate, as well as fund and finance the projects that move us towards those goals. And in all of our discussions globally, in all of our cities, there's always this gap that we talk about in terms of reaching the right kinds of projects. And so for us, a lot of that has been to empower the movement and keep that going. And we see this around the world, where resilience as a post-COVID, middle of COVID reaction was that resilience seemed to, and the interdependencies, the systemic interdependencies that Monica referred to, became more clear to people because of the cascading effects. And so our approach is to say, if the cascading effects can be negative from the collision of shocks and stresses at the same time, then if we are using a mindset, a recovery mindset, then we can also have cascading benefits. And that is, if we build it into the projects, if we build it into the policies, the legislation, wherever we are in the world, that we're going to have the co-benefits and resilience dividends flow out from those projects. And it can start with a small project, a small bioswale project with nature-based solutions in just a neighborhood in a city that starts to propagate, right? And it starts to move from neighborhood to neighborhood. And that's why we're looking at, even at the deal level or at the project level, what it means to be resilient and what it means to use that resilience value to start to measure ahead of time where we move. And I think for all of us, the challenge is, and you can hear this in the descriptions from everyone, we're actually trying to pay forward for something to not occur. And that's difficult to measure. It's difficult to say for the Sustainable Development Goals, we want these things not to happen. So therefore we must put in place the things that hem that in, that are the guardrails for us, especially for the most vulnerable communities. Because obviously what happens quite often is the most vulnerable communities are the ones that are impacted when something goes wrong. There's already stresses in a community that is next to a river that has pollution from industry, and then there's a flood, and then there's a hurricane or a cyclone. And so that tends to be the exacerbated situation where those places that are already vulnerable get hit the hardest, and they don't have the mechanisms to quickly rebound and respond to it. And I think one of the things that we continue to preach, and I'm always on my soapbox about this, is that resilience has often been relegated to being able to survive. We heard this a lot during COVID. We hear it now. We hear it now in the conflict in Ukraine, right? The point of it is it not to just be surviving. We want people to be able to adapt and grow and thrive and choose how they want to. So the comments around stakeholders are really important for us, because it's to whom, for whom, by whom in the building of resilience that's really important. So I'll leave my comments there, and looking forward to the discussion and see if we can dig in a little bit further here. And as Richard said, what do we do when we come out of this? Because I think we're very much in the action phase.
And that's where I want to go next, because this was great. It was a great setting the framework, but Richard's very again, he lives what he says, very action oriented. He wants us, and I think we owe our audience, to dig a little deeper now. And so some of the things that came into my head when we were discussing, and I encourage the audience, if you have any questions or comments, to just enter them into the chat. That'll be fine. And I'd like to Monica, key off of some of the things that you said. And this is a huge problem. So you can look at it at the macro level and just be overwhelmed. But what about the project level? And I know you've been involved with many projects on the ground. Where do you see people adapting to this and innovating? Because infrastructure resilience, has historically been viewed as an extra cost. And I think what we're all trying to do is move that mindset from a cost to an investment that will provide a return over the lifespan of the project, whatever that is. So anything that you have worked on, and all of the work that you've done with water and PPPs for water management, are there a couple of examples you can give that would illustrate this, would illustrate thinking, innovatively and outside the box in putting these investments together?
Thank you. Thank you, David. It's a tough question, but maybe just though before I'll try to give 2 examples, like you were asking me, but I need to say that I think the main challenge, and at least that's what I've also been looking at, is also how to go from that master planning, a strategic planning phase in which, for example, the Netherlands is very strong and working in Delta plans, in Bangladesh and different places, but to get to the investment pipeline, right? Because there is a disconnection now. So the people like normally, actually, before joining the PPP, my PhD was on PPPs, and you act when you know you want a road from A to B, right? And then you have good teams who know about how to make it bankable and all these things. But basically, the people involved in gathering all that wisdom at the beginning and understanding the systemic risk is not necessarily out of a master plan of 30 measures. The 3 that cost more money are the ones who are going to get the better people to structure them. All the other things get orphaned somewhere in the process. So for me, before I jump into the project, is how do we make sure we build that bridge, right? And also
very
we don't
important point.
Yeah, because now also sometimes we come to plans that are beautiful technically, but you can't pay for them, right? Or you can make them work. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of projects, I think there are basically number of places who have moved in the use of performance-based contracts or output-based aid, right? That where on, there were 2 PPP projects, for example, in UK, in which one of them is Broadland Plain Park, where you have a combination of gray and nature-based solutions, and then you have a good scheme how risks are, like certain risks are clearly on the contractor or project developer side, but the risk of really extreme weather and others are together, right? With the Environment Agency and the private sector. So it was very well thought in terms. Now the difficulty with resilience and the nature-based solutions often is to have really good functional requirements and indicators that show, and also to decide when is like contractor negligence and when is nature or when is the scale, right? Because most of the water projects is different than road projects and other things they are so exposed to decisions taking upstream somewhere else. So that the difficulty is there to get the right incentives in the contracts. I think if we solve that, and I feel we have not put enough part on that, and we jump from, there is a problem, of course, to get private finance for resilience and adaptation. But if we feel sure that we have good contractual arrangements for performance-based, contracts in which the public sector would pay for a certain level of service, we're solving part of the issue, because you get private sector involved, understanding how does resilience and adaptation work, and then they can get to be investors, and get more like kind of build, operate, transfer type of project. So
that's Monica, I'm going to interrupt you. That's a very important point, and I think that could be an action item, Richard, is to act very intently on educating both sectors, but especially the public sector, on the value of resilience, of integrating resilience and sustainability into these projects. Because again, I think we all know this, we all live it. I think that there are public sector, and I'm going to, Stewart, I'm going to give you warning. I'm going to pick on you on impact investing. And then Tony, I have a subject that you're very familiar with, so you're not going to have to even think about it.
Right.
But bringing people up to speed on what is happening with the climate, number one. Number two, how that impacts their investments in infrastructure. And number three, why it is absolutely not an expense anymore. It's an investment that will reduce the cost of these projects, both initially and over the life of them. So that leads me, and Monica led me right into this. Thank you, Monica, because she talked about contracts and talked about, putting clauses in to try to deal with some of these risks. And that brings up a word that anyone that's ever dealt with public-private partnerships knows well, and that's force majeure. And force majeure is, for those of you that don't know, force majeure is a clause that's in a contract that says if something outside the control of the private sector partner causes severe damage, severe disruption, that they have a provision so that they are adversely affected, but they're not critically adversely affected. And when COVID came along, no one had force majeure for a pandemic. And, you know, that dynamic is now obviously being examined. But with the increased severity and number of natural disasters, you know, force majeure is a hot topic, because how do you assess the risk, and where do you both sides of the agreement, how do you assess the risks, and what is reasonable and acceptable? So Tony, I'd love for you to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, David. Again, another challenging question. Maybe because I was thinking about what Richard asked us, right? About the action points, that he wants action points, right. And maybe I can suggest one for you, and maybe I can also answer to the question that you had previously asked me about financing earlier. One, and I think this is something that also Richard mentioned earlier. It's about the trillions of dollars. I think he mentioned the pension funds in the US that have available to use, and this is the most frustrating thing that you could have. At least for me, in the United Nations, that investors and debt providers keep telling me that there are millions, billions, trillions of dollars out there. What is lacking is projects, and this is the most frustrating thing. If you tell me, okay, I have a good idea, I have a good project, but there is no one ready to put money in it. It's the other way around. There is money floating out there, and there are not enough sufficient projects. So that's one aspect of it. To make it a bit more complicated, more and more we see a tendency by debt providers and investors to use ESG tools in their decision making, meaning that and these ESG tools are great in the sense that they are inspired by the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm not complaining. I'm saying that this adds a layer of complexity to the whole issue. Oh, yeah. So these ESG tools are used by lenders and debt providers, and they decide whether they should invest in a particular project or not. So perhaps an action point would be, it is important that governments are aware that lenders and debt providers are using ESG tools. And therefore, governments in preparing their projects should also use from the design stage, ESG tools to make sure that once they bring their projects to the market in a few years' time, that they will find the necessary financing. Because otherwise, there will be a divorce between a fast-moving lending, financing, sustainable financing, I would say, market, and the projects being prepared by governments. So unless governments already now become aware of this shift in financing, then otherwise, and this is our role. This is my job. My job essentially is to make sure that my constituency, my shareholders, the governments, are aware of this trend, of these changes. And in our advice to them, in our capacity building and technical assistance that we give them, we make sure that that this is the case. So perhaps you might want to consider it as an action point, that, you know, to make sure that governments are fully aware of the need to use ESG tools in their projects at the early stage.
Absolutely, and that you and Monica are basically echoing each other. And I think that is, if there's not any other action item, it is that we must educate both sectors on what is really happening. So Stewart, that leads me to you, and just trying to keep us on time. If you have about 6 minutes to talk about impact investing and that new but fast growing sector's role in improving infrastructure resilience. And, you know, our friend Howard Buffett, who was on Richard's agenda earlier, you know, specializes in that in these tools, but I know you're very involved with it, as am I. So if you just take a few minutes and kind of give us an overview of that, and then specifically where you think this is going to go, I think, and then I'm going to turn it, Richard, as soon as Stewart's finished, take off, because I'm going to turn it over to you for the remainder of the program.
Great, thanks. So on the impact investing and community development finance side, I think it's the same conversation that right now Tony and Monica are bringing up, and I would actually push back a little bit and say that one side says there's no funding, and the other side says there's no projects. And I think in our work, because we did strategies that resulted in thousands, tens of thousands really, of projects, we continue to hear that it's more about the middle ground that we need to fix, and that's where public-private partnerships come into play. And I think part of this is I've got loads of projects to give to financiers, and I know there are pools of funds of varying kinds, and a growing number of them actually in the last 2 to 5 years that are looking to find those projects. Where we sit, especially in all my work and in the Resilient Cities work, is kind of in the middle, to say hello on this side and hello on this side, and let's find our place in the middle. And part of that is to say, how do we define them? How do we screen and scale them? All the questions in the comments that have been made already. And I think the same thing on the community development finance and impact investing side. And this is even the case for the sort of DFIs. Just yesterday or the day before, I presented our tool that we've been testing with financial institutions. And those institutions and those loan officers have been testing them against actual deals, and very small up to larger sort of mid-sized deals. And the presentation a couple of days ago was to a larger group of financial institutions working at the global level to say, if it's not ESG, if it's not some other kind of screen or tool or checklist, can we not use something like this tool for those DFIs who are looking at deals of a range of scales and sizes, so that we're all speaking the same language inside the government and on the private side? The impact investors have moved towards impact and social impact investing earlier than the banks, earlier than finance, and they have supported community development finance in its various forms around the world. We started with a smaller sector of the community development finance area to test this tool on actual deals to see how developers and borrowers would react. And those reactions and that feedback led us to say, there's other sectors we need to talk to. Let's make sure we're talking to the buildings codes people. Let's make sure we're talking to the development sector, real estate, engineers, designers, architects, right? You can go down the list and imagine if they all had a similar script, like we've been talking and testing with the institutions that we've been doing it with. And the impact investing space is more akin to that than it is to the DFI and global fund side of things. And what we need to do is start to marry those and bring them together so that in the middle, cities who have projects are getting them project prepped correctly in that sort of resilience lens way, so that the return on investment, as one of our cohort members and deal testers said, I want to normalize resilience inside my underwriting. It's a risk, it's a risk aversion that we need to implement. and it can have an equitable and holistic viewpoint to it, but it's still part of our risk analysis. So I want to normalize resilience so that we don't look at it as something we're plopping on top to make things more difficult or expensive. And that's been the intriguing thing about this in the impact space, in the community development finance space, and on into the more global funds. How do we do that so that we're not saying it's an add-on, right? It's kind of what Tony was saying about ESG. At a minimum, please use those screens to tell you whether or not that next deal is starting to hit at a few things that cascade benefits, not challenges or effects from the negative. So we're seeing a shift in that. And I think also global philanthropy has a huge role in this. We see this in Asia, in Latin America, and other parts of the world. How does global philanthropy infuse that into their work and then into the impact space, so that when we do a pay for success project around circular economy and plastics in Asia, that those elements are fused together, right? Because for us, it's not just ROI, return on investment, it's the return on the resilience value. So the RORV, as I call it, has to be there and it has to be baked in and normalized. Otherwise, it seems like an add-on again and again. And so that's part of our challenge, I think, is like projects meet money, here's the lens, now let's go to work on the project. And I think that's part of what we all have to take away from this panel too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Richard, it's all yours.
Well, let me, I want to throw a question to all of y'all, and then I want to put an observation on the table to also get a reaction. David, we built 15 minutes in to the panel because there's just too many smart people. We could probably go for another hour, but we got to do this in sound bites. So let me tie a thread through the initial remarks. Monica, systems approach. We're no longer talking about just one asset anymore. We can talk about a water treatment facility, or we can talk about a bridge, but the reality is that we are really now looking to be much more system approach with all of the assets. That's number one piece. Second, Tony, fit for purpose P3s. All right. I mean, this is how, you know, the Department of Defense, United States, now won't do any project that isn't fit for purpose, right? But defining that purpose in a broader context, all right? We know I want to move something from here to there, or I want to reduce something, but now we're looking at a much more integrated purpose, system, integrated, fit for purpose. And then third, leveraging Stewart's point about mobilizing where you're really getting a cascading set of benefits. Not one benefit, multiple benefits. Not just, quote unquote, paying for the project, but seeing how the ancillary benefits that often are not measured that have, so what I heard, David, is we need to have a systems approach. We need to have fit for purpose, that's defined purpose that tends to be multiple purposes, which adds complexity, all right? And then we really need to look at these benefits, the cost benefit analysis that creates more benefits. So I'm in total agreement. What we've just done is we've layered on significant complexity to governments who often are scared of complex. So that then gets me to the observation. So I have a question, and the question is, how do we now take all three of these elements and build it into the right kind of model for delivery? And I don't care if it's a pilot project. Let's go get one good, solid. But then the second observation is something to Stewart, your point. I think we need to talk about resilience donor advised funds. Resilience donor advised funds. Because what the insurance and reinsurance community, Tony, is telling me is they are looking for a 1 to 6 or better cost benefit. Pre-disaster risk mitigated, right? So question on the table, how do we take these elements of complexity, but are needed and required, into a model that we can look at from a pilot or demonstration? And then second of all, is one of the solutions on the funding and financing is to look at resilience donor advised funds. So I'm going to open it. Monica, I learned that being in Texas, the lady always goes first.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I really liked your take and the question, you know, how do we deal with this complexity? And I think there, basically part of building that bridge I work on is, I think we need to teach everyone in government, right? And actually participating in the investment origination to zoom out first and then zoom in into the contractual, no, nitty-gritty details. And that partly is like, I think in Latin America and many places, we're already talking about the nexus, right? So what energy, food nexus. So I totally agree that we have to zoom out, and resilience, adaptation, even water would profit if we are able as communities separate to show how that is not an add-on, like Stewart was saying, but it simply contributes to that long-term vision that you have. And I feel that's where we are failing, because right now it's not clear to me what does the future looks like. For example, in a water basin in Peru where I was working. So is drip irrigation the solution, or is a complete different value chain the solution, right? So I think we have to get better to zoom out and vision, and then zoom in to say what investment do we do now, tomorrow. And in that part, my opinion is that it's good to look at the cost benefit, but still we need to boil down all these multifunctionality to maximum 3 to 4 functions that pay back for these investments. And for those, we have to write down good functional requirements, indicators, and so forth, right? So that I hope, and last part, and I can't expand on that, but the capacity at the local level to do that. I think it's not system analysis really are simple tools that we can teach people to do this graphically and advance it, no? So that's
Perfect. Monica, thank you. Tony?
Thank you, Richard. I think from a government perspective, what the Sustainable Development Goals have taught us, or what they have brought to the table, which perhaps didn't exist that prominently before they came into being, so before 2015, is that yes, we need to look at projects, but we need to look beyond what the project is about. So let me give you an example. A road, it's not just taking us from A to B. It is how it is going to transform the communities that these roads, take us from A to B. So how it is going to be affecting them positively, how it is, addressing their situation, poverty, creating jobs, but also how it is linking them to other facilities, how it is linking them to hospitals, to schools. So I think we need to look at projects not just for the function that they are supposed to do originally, be it, it doesn't matter what kind of asset we are talking about, but the transformational effect of those projects on the communities that they are serving.
Perfect. Stewart?
Yeah, I'm going to key off Tony just a little bit because there's so much to say here, but I have one slide in, I just got done teaching 5 modules for the International University of Catalonia, and it was just on resilience finance, and there were 5 different modules and various elements of it. But in the section where we talk about external financing for cities, I talk about public-private partnerships, and there's one slide that I always have lots of conversations with the students about, and that is whether it's a PPP for resilience or a resilient PPP. And it might sound like I'm being cheeky and mixing language here, but it's truly what Tony is getting at, which is and this goes to the comment about normalizing resilience, sometimes those PPPs and those projects really are resilience builders. They're just inherently that way.
Right.
What we need to do, and this has been the job of the chief resilience officers, right, is to say, we're going to do this PPP, but we're actually layering in those other elements. And I think that's the tricky part. Monica's right. Like, you know, it can look like it costs more money. One short story on the tool we were testing, one of the very first loan officers went to a developer who was the borrower on an affordable housing project. And while he was using the tool and doing the underwriting, he said to the developer, this is scary, right? I'd like you to change these 5 things: permeable pavement, basement level, HVAC on the roof, hookups for solar and storage, hookups for generator, even if you don't put those in right away. All 5 of those things, the developer said, I'll go pencil it out. Incremental increase in my work, in my project, but I'm going to do it because look what, because he could calculate the safety and resilience, literally value of that property for the purchasers over time, right? And he came back and said, I'll do it. And guess what? I'm going to do it on the rest of my affordable housing projects, right? So to Richard's point, we need to find those projects and do it at scale again and again and again. It's less top down, even though all of us have to work a little top down sometimes. And to Monica's point about going up 30,000 feet and going down, right? We call it the continuum. We want to work at the project level to resilience size and to bake it in. And we want to work at the global level, at a policy, SDG level, and then everything in between, right? And it's really important because not every country is going to have the same structure of where the funds flow, if they're federal versus city versus state, province, et cetera. And we have to be ready to sort of shift when that's not the case. But I think that's been the lesson for me, is that we can incrementally do it, and we also have to do it at the very highest level, but find those ways to say, here's how we do it from a systemic standpoint, even though you're just talking about one project, right? And that takes time, because that loan officer and the next loan officer and the next loan officer, the next city procurement officer, because it's easy to de-resilience projects, even if they get into a strategy. Because when it gets to procurement, right, you're just talking dollars and cents.
So let me share 2 or 3 quick observations, and then share with our audience our next set of activities. Because David, I've always said this, and I say this jokingly, the investor forum has nothing to do with anybody else. It's just all about me. I like hearing from really, really smart people, all right, and trying to figure out what we all can actually do. So this is all this is just a ruse for me to be able to listen to the smart people. Let me throw a couple of observations, all right? Monica, it's about the RFP. If we don't get governments to write an RFP correctly, but also not try to proscribe that I'm going to have you move rocks from here to there, but we want the handle of the wagon to be this long, we want the wheels to be painted 5 different colors, and so we need to unleash innovation through the RFP process, down to the ability to say, we trust that you know how to develop a project for us, but here's the performance and the measurements that we're trying. And by the way, you're not going to get paid unless you achieve those performances. So that's one observation. The second observation to something, Stewart, that you raised and Tony raised about the capital and aligning the capital to the projects. I'm now convinced it's about confidence, Tony. It's about building confidence in front of whether it's government, civic, corporate leaders, that they can see that this can work. And we've got to give them more confidence in being able to see, to Stewart's point. So this is my last observation. I was with a young lady a couple of days ago making a presentation. She and her group have built out 168 water wells in Africa, all from a nonprofit perspective, 168 water wells, all right? Because these are places that are in the middle of droughts or water. They have a lot of water, but it's not the right kind of water. The water, in the way that it's designed, has a solar power generator to bring light and power to the villages. The water and the power combined are now driving the education, the new healthcare centers, but then it starts providing water for irrigation into. So what I'm getting at is, I think we're all headed towards the same thing. Something that is a spark or powerful enough to have an immediate ripple into these areas of resilience. And frankly, the four of y'all know this better than anybody. There is a lot of innovation capacity and there's a lot of capital. So my call to action with the four of y'all is, let's go find 3 to 5 projects anywhere that we can raise up to a level of an innovation prize and a competition that gets the educational component, gets the awareness. And Stewart, you and I have talked a little bit about this. This goes, right? But I think now the combined knowledge of the four of y'all and others, let's go target some very specific projects, all right? And it's not that we need to go create them, it's how we unleash the innovation capacity as well. So with that, I want to thank David, you for assembling this incredible brain power. I know that I put a call to action on the table. We're not going to be able to draft it up in an hour and 15 minutes, but my sense is that there is no competition amongst the 5 of us. If anything, we all want the same outcomes. Let's figure out a way to take this and some of our other networks and, over the next couple of weeks, really let's go find a couple of definitive projects, all right? Now, we've got a number of other sessions coming up as we finish out the Innovation Forum with some of our federal partners. Fitch Ratings, Tony, we believe very strongly that you use Moody's and the rating system to help drive some of the ESG SDG goals, okay? Because the mortgage bankers and the financing houses are beginning to look at this. We're focused on data and we're focused on increasing the industry folks out there. So we've set up our engagement platform. I'm going to be getting out the final link to everybody so that we can use this phenomenal platform that's taken a little bit longer. We've got a number of events coming up. And then, based on what we are doing, David, as you and I have talked about, we are recording this, we are populating it out, all right? And out of all of this, David, with your good work and Stewart's good work as a partner in the Resilience Innovation Hub, I think the focus of our investor forum should be to find ways to connect, like I said, but to drive a call to action. So Monica, Tony, Stewart, and David, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules. Have a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to us. Seriously, you're not off the hook. All right. So Tony, we know where to find you. Okay. Thank you all for your time and energy today. It's been incredibly powerful for me. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful, healthy, safe weekend.
Thanks, Richard.
You.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for doing this.